You might think that after years of marriage, people stop changing. But what if I told you that in just 90 days, he transformed from the man his wife barely recognized into someone she now sees as a completely different person? It wasn't about some miraculous overnight fix or a secret to instant success. No, it was about an unshakable decision, a commitment to change, and the surprising consequences that came with it. This isn't just a story about quitting something, it's a story about rediscovering who you are and how it can completely shift everything around you. His wife, she watched in disbelief as he went from someone struggling with bad habits and an unhealthy lifestyle to a man who was unrecognizable in the best way possible. But how did he do it? What were the moments of doubt, the setbacks, and the breakthroughs? And most importantly, what happened when his wife finally saw the new man he'd become? Stay tuned, because this is the story of transformation you won't want to miss. It all started with a quiet, almost insignificant thought that crossed John's mind one evening. After a particularly exhausting day, he had just returned home from work, his usual routine of grabbing something quick to eat and plopping down on the couch to binge-watch TV feeling more and more hollow with every passing day. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was his constant fatigue, or the way his clothes were starting to feel a little tighter. Maybe it was the growing distance between him and his wife, Lisa. They had once been so connected, so close, but lately, the small talk had become just that small. Their evenings together felt more like two people passing through the same space, but living in entirely different worlds. They hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. John wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way their bond had been replaced by the dullness of routine and the weight of unhealthy habits. And the worst part? He didn't know how to change it. John had always been a man of routine. His days were predictable. Wake up, work, eat whatever was quick, come home, crash on the couch, and repeat. He wasn't particularly unhealthy, but he wasn't exactly thriving either. His energy levels were low, his motivation was even lower, and as he looked in the mirror he barely recognized the man staring back at him. He felt sluggish, worn out, and detached from the man he used to be. He'd gained weight, and his doctor had started hinting at things like pre-diabetic and high cholesterol. But it wasn't just about the physical side of things. The emotional toll was wearing him down just as much. There were moments when he'd find himself standing in the kitchen, looking at his reflection in the window, wondering if this was really the life he'd imagined for himself. Was this how it was supposed to be in his 40s, just trudging along, day after day, stuck in the same unhealthy habits? Lisa, his wife, had noticed the changes too. She saw the way John's energy had slipped, how he'd start a conversation with her, and then lose interest halfway through. She could feel the disconnect growing between them, but she didn't know how to bridge that gap. It wasn't like she wasn't trying. She'd encourage him to get outside, to take a walk, to eat healthier, but it always felt like the words were falling on deaf ears. He wasn't angry or resistant, but there was a sense of resignation in him that she couldn't shake. It was as if John had resigned himself to this new, tired version of his life. And as the months went by, Lisa found herself asking, is this the man I married? Is this the future we imagined? The passion, the energy, the joy they once shared seemed like distant memories, slowly slipping through their fingers, leaving them in a quiet, unspoken rut. Then one night it happened. John was sitting on the couch after dinner, scrolling aimlessly on his phone, when an idea hit him out of nowhere. What if he just quit? What if he made a decision, just one decision, to give up the things that were holding him back? He didn't need a grand plan. He didn't need some dramatic revelation. He just needed to make a commitment. For 90 days, no excuses, no compromises. He would give up the unhealthy habits that had slowly crept into his life. No more junk food, no more late-night binging, no more passive living. It would be a reset, a chance to find his footing again, to rediscover his energy, and to reconnect with the man he used to be. And maybe, just maybe, he could bring some of that back into his marriage too. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he felt something inside him stirring, like the spark of a fire long extinguished, just waiting to be reignited. The next day, John told Lisa about his decision. She was surprised, maybe even a little skeptical, but she listened intently. She'd heard him talk about wanting to change before, only to see the excitement fade after a week or two. But this time was different. He wasn't just talking, he was making a commitment, a real one. She could sense it in his tone, in the way he looked at her. He was serious, and as much as she wanted to believe in him, she couldn't help but wonder, will this time be any different? She didn't know if it was the spark of hope or the quiet fear of disappointment, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that this decision might be the turning point in their lives. For better or for worse. John started slow. The first few days were a breeze. He cut out junk food, swapped his evening TV sessions for walks around the neighborhood, and replaced his usual go-to snacks with healthier options. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The cravings hit hard. He was used to reaching for chips or a chocolate bar whenever he felt the slightest bit of hunger or boredom. It wasn't just the physical act of eating, it was the emotional comfort that came with it. It was his way of coping with stress, boredom, and even loneliness. And now that coping mechanism was gone. It was harder than he thought, but he kept going. He replaced those snacks with fruits, nuts, and smoothies. He drank water instead of soda. He focused on getting enough sleep, waking up earlier, and starting his days with a sense of purpose. But as John's habits started to change, so did his routine, and so did his relationship with Lisa. The first week wasn't perfect. There were moments when John would get frustrated, moments when the old habits seemed too tempting to ignore. He felt the familiar pull of the couch and the allure of mindless TV, but he fought against it. He didn't just want to change his body, he wanted to change his life. He wanted to reconnect with Lisa, not just as a partner, but as a person who could once again share his goals, his dreams, and the future they had put on hold. And for the first time in months, John felt like he was taking charge of his life again. Lisa noticed it too. At first, it was subtle, a little more energy in his step, a few more moments of laughter around the house. But as the days went on, she started seeing a shift in him that made her hopeful. She wasn't ready to call it a miracle, but she couldn't deny that there was something different about the way John was carrying himself. He wasn't just making small changes, he was changing the way he approached life itself, and that shift, that quiet transformation, was exactly what they both needed. John didn't know it yet, but those first 30 days were just the beginning. His decision to quit was more than just about losing weight or getting healthier. It was about rediscovering himself, about finding his way back to the person he used to be, and the person Lisa had always loved. But would it last? And what would happen when the 90 days were up? Could this new version of him stick around, or would the old habits find their way back in? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the journey had only just begun. The first 30 days were undeniably tough for John. He had imagined that, with a little discipline, he'd just glide through the first month, powering through his bad habits like a man on a mission. But reality was far more challenging than he'd anticipated. The cravings hit hard. On the third day, John found himself staring at the candy jar in the kitchen. It was the jar that had always been his weakness. Whenever he felt stressed, bored, or tired, that jar was a beacon calling out to him, promising a quick sugar rush to get him through the day. He had told himself he wouldn't give in, but as his hand hovered over the lid, the temptation felt almost unbearable. Lisa was in the living room when she noticed him eyeing the jar. She didn't say anything, but the silence between them was thick with unsaid words. She knew how hard it was for him. She could see the struggle in his eyes. She also knew that he was trying, really trying to change, but could he keep it up? That was the question that hung in the air. John pulled his hand away, but it wasn't because the temptation had vanished. It was because he felt Lisa's eyes on him, and he didn't want to disappoint her. He turned around and walked out of the kitchen, his stomach growling in protest. He had to remind himself why he was doing this. The decision wasn't just about him. It was about Lisa, about their marriage, about the possibility of regaining control over his life. So he grabbed a handful of almonds instead, chewing slowly, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of hunger and longing for his usual comfort food. But the first 30 days weren't just about food. They were about breaking an entire lifestyle that had become ingrained in him over years. It was about breaking old patterns and starting fresh. John had always used food as a crutch. He was never one to go out for exercise or push himself physically. He had always been someone who worked long hours, who sat at a desk and lived for the weekend. when he could kick back and unwind with a drink and some snacks in front of the TV. And then there was the habit of working late, which often meant grabbing fast food or microwaving something quick for dinner. This cycle had kept him comfortable for years, but he now saw it for what it was, a trap. The first week wasn't too bad, at least on the surface. John was motivated. He was pumped by the idea of doing something different, something that felt like a fresh start. He had even begun to feel a little better physically. He wasn't waking up with a foggy head or the usual bloated feeling after a late-night snack binge. But once the newness wore off, the true challenge began to set in. The old habits had a way of creeping back into his mind when things got difficult. For example, on day 8, John had an argument with a coworker. Nothing major, just a miscommunication that turned into a small misunderstanding. But for John, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. His frustration boiled over, and his immediate reaction was to reach for the comfort he had always known: food. Specifically, pizza. The idea of sinking into a cheesy, greasy slice of pizza felt like the perfect way to numb the irritation. But he stopped himself. He thought about the 90-day commitment he'd made. He thought about Lisa, and how he had promised her that this was going to be the moment when everything would change. But the struggle wasn't just in his mind, it was physical. He felt the pull of the old patterns trying to take hold. It was like the old John was still lurking there, waiting to emerge. That night, instead of ordering pizza, John went for a walk. It wasn't easy, and he felt a bit ridiculous at first, walking around the block in the dark, trying to shake off the frustration and temptation. But with every step, he could feel the weight of his old habits beginning to lift. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a step in the right direction. He realized that he had been using food to cope with his emotions, and now he was learning to face his emotions head-on without any crutches. Lisa noticed the change too, though she wasn't sure what to make of it. At first, she wasn't sure how to react. On one hand, she was proud of him for sticking to his commitment, for choosing healthier habits. But on the other hand, she couldn't help but feel a little left out. Their evenings used to be spent together, sitting on the couch, unwinding after a long day with a glass of wine and a snack. Now John was walking around the block in the evenings, opting for water instead of wine, and spending less and less time in front of the TV. Her initial reaction was mixed. She was happy for him, but she also felt a bit disconnected. She wasn't sure if the changes in John meant that they were growing closer or growing apart. Their relationship had always been based on shared moments, those quiet evenings together with their usual routine. Now, she had to adjust to the idea of him being different, of him becoming someone she didn't fully recognize yet. It wasn't that she didn't support him, it was that she had no idea how to support him in this new chapter of his life. And honestly, she didn't know if he could stick with it. The second week came, and the cravings started to get stronger. John found himself thinking about all the things he'd given up: his favorite takeout places, his usual snack stash, the comfort of a cold beer at the end of a stressful day. It wasn't just the food, it was the lifestyle he had always leaned on. He found himself missing the old rhythms of life, the old comfort zone. But something was different this time. He wasn't just passively accepting the cravings, he was actively choosing not to give in. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. By the end of the second week, John started noticing small changes. He had more energy in the mornings, and his clothes were fitting a little looser. He wasn't just walking around the block anymore. He had started jogging, even if just for a few minutes at a time. His sleep had improved too. For the first time in years, he wasn't waking up feeling sluggish. He felt more alert, more present, and more aware of what was going on around him. And most importantly, he felt like he was taking control of his life again. That sense of control, of agency, was something he hadn't felt in a long time, and it was addictive. But even with all these changes, the first 30 days were full of setbacks. There were still moments of doubt, moments when John wondered if it was all worth it. Could he really keep this up? Was this just another phase, or was he finally breaking free from the chains of his old habits? There were no easy answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But as the days passed, John began to realize something crucial. This wasn't just about the physical changes. It was about his mindset. It was about reclaiming his life, taking ownership of his health, and in the process, rediscovering who he really was. The first 30 days were just the beginning, but for John, They were already proving that change was possible, and that he was ready for whatever came next. As John moved into the second month of his 90-day challenge, something began to shift. The initial excitement, the motivation that had propelled him through the first 30 days, was starting to settle into something deeper. His body was no longer in shock. It had begun to adjust to the changes he had made. The cravings were still there, lingering in the back of his mind, but they had lost their grip on him. Something inside him had clicked, and he was starting to realize that this wasn't just about quitting unhealthy habits. It was about transforming his entire lifestyle. His focus had gone from "I can't believe I'm doing this" to "this feels like the new me." By now, his physical changes were becoming more noticeable. Lisa had commented on how much more energetic he seemed, how he no longer needed to take a nap after work, how he was becoming more involved in their daily life. It wasn't just about weight loss, although he had shed a few pounds. It was the way he held himself, the way he moved, the way he carried an air of confidence that had been absent for so long. He had always been a quiet person, someone who went with the flow and didn't rock the boat. But now there was something different about him. He had purpose in his steps, clarity in his decisions, and a newfound optimism that was beginning to radiate from him. One of the first things John noticed was his energy. He had always been a guy who felt sluggish in the mornings, dragging himself out of bed and barely getting through the workday without feeling completely drained. But now, he found himself waking up before his alarm, feeling rested, alert, and ready to take on the day. It was a small change, but it was a big deal. For the first time in years, he was starting to feel like he had control over his life again. His mornings were no longer clouded by exhaustion and self-doubt. He felt like he was beginning to win the internal battle that had held him back for so long. Lisa noticed these changes too. She could see it in the way he interacted with her, in the way he greeted her in the morning, how he started initiating conversations instead of just responding. He was more present, more engaged, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago was beginning to resurface. The emotional disconnect that had plagued their relationship for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something that felt much more genuine, a sense of partnership, of shared experience. She was proud of him. She was proud of his commitment, of his perseverance. But there was something more. She was starting to fall in love with him again, not just with the person he was, but with the person he was becoming. However, the change wasn't always easy for her. As John's transformation began to take hold, Lisa started to feel something she hadn't expected: uncertainty. She was happy for him, but there was an underlying tension that she couldn't ignore. She hadn't realized how much she had relied on the old John, the one who used food and comfort as a way of coping with stress. He had been her partner in that. They shared a rhythm, a way of living that had been theirs. It was comfortable, even if it wasn't the healthiest. But now, John was changing, and with it, so were their routines. She wasn't sure if this was a change she could fully embrace. Was she prepared for this new version of him? Did she even know how to support him in this journey when she was still trying to figure out how she fit into it? At the same time, John's changes began to seep into other areas of his life. He started working out more consistently, going to the gym before work or taking longer walks in the evenings. He could feel his body getting stronger. His muscles weren't just aching from the exertion. They were growing, toning, and responding to the new routines he had adopted. There were moments when he would catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror, surprised at the reflection staring back at him. He wasn't just looking different, he was feeling different. He could see the definition starting to appear in his arms and shoulders, a stark contrast to the soft, tired man he used to be. It was like he was uncovering a version of himself that had been buried under years of unhealthy habits and complacency. But the physical changes weren't the only thing that was happening. John's mind was clearing too. He had been so used to feeling sluggish, to having brain fog cloud his thoughts, that he hadn't realized how much that had affected his ability to focus on the things that mattered. Now his thinking was sharper. He was more decisive, less distracted, and he found himself setting goals for the first time in a long time. He had a new clarity about what he wanted from life, and that was a huge revelation. He realized that in many ways, he had been coasting through life, letting his bad habits dictate the course of his days. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was actively choosing the direction he wanted to take. He wasn't just letting life happen to him, he was shaping it. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were still moments of doubt. There were days when the old habits would whisper in his ear, telling him to quit, telling him that he couldn't keep going, that it was too hard, too much. He would feel the pull of his old routine, the comfort of slipping back into familiar patterns. But each time, he resisted. The temptation still lingered, but it was becoming weaker. The more he resisted, the stronger his resolve became. And as the days went on, John found that his commitment was no longer just about the 90-day goal. It was about something bigger. It was about reclaiming his life. It was about living with intention, something he hadn't truly done in years. Lisa continued to watch with a mixture of awe and uncertainty as John navigated this transformation. She could see the man he was becoming, but she wasn't sure how to reconcile the changes with the life they had built together. She hadn't expected it to be this hard to adjust to him being different. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the emotional and relational shifts that came with it. But deep down, she knew something important. John's change wasn't just for him. It was for them. It was for their future together. And despite the challenges, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. As John entered the third month of his 90-day challenge, the changes became even more apparent. He was a new man, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But as much as he had transformed, the real question was this: would he be able to maintain these changes once the 90 days were over? Could he sustain this version of himself, or would he fall back into the comfortable routines of his past? That was the unknown that loomed ahead of him. But for now, he was focusing on the present, on the moment he was living in. And for the first time in a long time, that moment felt full of possibility. Lisa had her own challenges to face, but she was starting to realize something. John's transformation wasn't just about him. It was about them. And maybe, just maybe, this journey they were on together could bring them closer than they had ever been before. By the time John reached the final stretch of his 90-day challenge, the changes were undeniable. What had started as a mere commitment to quit unhealthy habits had evolved into a full-blown transformation. His body had reshaped itself, his energy was boundless, and his outlook on life had taken a 180-degree turn. But the most significant shift wasn't just in the way he looked or felt, it was in the way he viewed himself, and more importantly, the way his wife Lisa began to see him. As the days counted down, John couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when he felt like giving up. There had been days when he was tempted to throw in the towel, when the cravings felt too intense to ignore, when the comfort of his old habits seemed more inviting than the hard work and discipline he had been practicing. But those moments were fewer and farther between now. He had pushed through the tough times, and now, standing at the finish line, he realized that the person he was about to become wasn't just someone who had quit bad habits. It was someone who had reinvented himself from the inside out. Lisa had noticed the change from the very beginning, but by this point, it was almost impossible to ignore. She saw it in the way John moved through the house. His steps were lighter, more purposeful. She saw it in the way he spoke, how his words carried more weight now, how he was more engaged in their conversations, no longer zoning out or withdrawing into himself when things got tough. She saw it in the way he looked at her, with admiration, with love, with the same intensity he had shown her when they were first together. The emotional distance that had once stretched between them seemed to have shrunk, and they were now reconnected in a way they hadn't been for years. She couldn't believe how different he was, and in the quiet moments when they sat together on the couch or had dinner, she couldn't help but think, this is the man I fell in love with. But it wasn't just Lisa who saw the change. John noticed it too. He had always been a quiet guy, someone who preferred to keep to himself. But now he felt like he was standing taller, like he had a purpose beyond just getting through the day. The old John, the one who had been tired, worn out, and disconnected, felt like a distant memory. In his place was someone who had finally taken control, who had stopped letting life pass him by and started taking the reins. It was like waking up from a long slumber, realizing that he had been living in autopilot for years, and now for the first time he was truly living. But with all this change came something unexpected. John found himself at a crossroads. He had come so far, but now the real question loomed over him. Could he keep this up? Could he maintain this new version of himself once the 90 days were over? The truth was, he wasn't sure. He didn't want to go back to the person he had been. He didn't want to fall back into his old patterns of complacency, of laziness, of unhealthy eating and drinking. But he also knew that the temptation would always be there. Old habits die hard, and the pull of the comfortable, easy lifestyle was still strong. What John didn't realize was that Lisa, too, was facing her own internal struggle. As much as she had supported him, as much as she had encouraged him through the ups and downs, she wasn't sure how to adjust to this new version of him. It wasn't that she didn't love him, she did. It wasn't that she wasn't proud of him, she was more proud than she had ever been. But there was something unsettling about seeing the man she had known for years suddenly become someone else. Their dynamic had always been built on shared routines, shared habits, and now those were changing. She didn't know how to fit into this new version of John. Could she keep up with the person he was becoming? Was she ready to face the reality of a relationship that was evolving so quickly, and in such unexpected ways? In those moments of doubt, Lisa's insecurities began to surface. Was she enough for him? What if the changes he was going through were just the beginning, and he was going to continue growing in ways she couldn't keep up with? She had always been the one to support him, to nurture him, to help him through tough times. But now, she was starting to feel like she was losing herself in the process. John was changing, but so was she. The question was, could they change together, or would these changes drive them apart? For John, these thoughts were also on his mind. He had been so focused on his own transformation, on rebuilding his life, that he hadn't fully considered the impact his changes would have on Lisa. She had always been his anchor, his steadying force, and now he was realizing that he needed to be just as supportive of her as she had been of him. He couldn't just expect her to adjust to this new version of him without taking the time to understand her perspective, to be there for her in the same way she had been there for him. It wasn't easy. There were moments when John questioned whether this journey was worth it, when he felt the pressure of trying to maintain this new life, trying to keep up the momentum, trying to prove to himself and to Lisa that this wasn't just a phase. But then he would remember how far he had come, how much he had changed. He realized that at the end of the day it wasn't just about the 90 days, it was about the rest of his life. And the rest of his life, he realized, was something he could actively shape. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. For Lisa, it was a journey of her own. As she watched John evolve, she had to come to terms with the fact that this new version of him wasn't just someone who had transformed physically or emotionally. It was someone who had changed in ways that challenged their entire relationship. She had to ask herself, could she embrace this change? Could she support John as he continued to evolve, as he became more than the man she had known? Or would she find herself stuck in the past, holding on to the man he had been, unable to move forward with him into this new chapter? In the final stretch of the 90 days, John's commitment to his transformation was unwavering. He had started seeing the results, both in the mirror and in his life. His body had changed, yes, but more importantly, his mindset had shifted. He was no longer the man he had been at the beginning of this journey. He had become someone who had taken control of his health, his habits, and his future. But as the days drew to a close, the reality set in. The work wasn't over. The 90 days had only been the beginning. Now it was time to build on the foundation he had created. As for Lisa, she was starting to realize that this journey was one they were on together, not just individually. The changes they had both experienced had shaken the foundation of their relationship, but they had also given them the opportunity to rebuild, to reconnect, and to evolve as a couple. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be worth it. Together they could face the challenges ahead and continue to grow, not just as individuals, but as partners. The 90 days were over, but for John and Lisa, the real work was just beginning. As the final days of John's 90-day challenge loomed ahead, the changes that had taken place in his life were starting to feel almost permanent. The physical transformation was undeniable. He had lost weight, built muscle, and was now more active than he had been in years. His body felt stronger, and his confidence was through the roof. But what struck him most wasn't how different he looked. It was how different he felt, both inside and out. His mindset had shifted in ways he hadn't expected, and for the first time in a long time, John realized that he was no longer just going through the motions of life. He was fully engaged, awake, and present in every aspect of his day. But as the days passed, John began to recognize something else. His relationship with Lisa had also changed. The emotional connection between them, which had been strained and distant for so long, was slowly being rebuilt. He couldn't deny it any longer. He had been so focused on his own transformation that he hadn't fully taken stock of how this journey had affected their dynamic as a couple. At first, Lisa had been supportive, but as time went on, she had seemed more and more distant, almost unsure of how to interact with the new John. She had witnessed his physical transformation with pride, but it was his emotional and mental transformation that had her questioning their future together. John's journey was one of personal growth, but Lisa was facing her own challenge: how to adapt to the new version of the man she had been married to for years. She had always known him to be a creature of habit, someone who found comfort in routine, even if those routines weren't the healthiest. But now, John was someone else. He wasn't just physically different, he was mentally and emotionally transformed. He was more decisive, more focused, and more engaged in their relationship. But as much as she appreciated the man he was becoming, Lisa couldn't help but feel a slight sense of fear creeping in. It wasn't that she didn't love him, she did deeply. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the changes he was making for himself. It was that she hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to adjust to this new dynamic. She found herself wondering if she could keep up with him, if she was capable of embracing this new version of John, without feeling left behind. Over the past few weeks, she had seen him push boundaries, achieve goals, and take charge of his life in ways she had never imagined. But in the back of her mind, she wondered, what about me? What about my own changes? Can we continue to grow together, or am I losing the person I once knew? It was in these quiet moments of doubt that Lisa began to reflect on her own journey, on her own role in their relationship. She realized that she too had changed, just not in the way John had. While he had become more focused, more disciplined, more intentional in every aspect of his life, she had remained stagnant. She had supported him every step of the way, encouraged him, cheered him on, but she hadn't taken the time to address her own habits, her own emotional needs, and her own growth. She had been so focused on supporting John that she hadn't realized she was neglecting herself. For Lisa, the realization was a wake-up call. She loved John, and she wanted to see him succeed, but she also had to recognize that she had to evolve alongside him. She couldn't stay in the same place while he continued to grow. If they were going to navigate this new chapter of their lives together, they would have to find a way to support each other's growth, not just his but hers as well. In the days that followed, Lisa began to have conversations with herself and with John about what she needed. She realized that she had to let go of some of the fears that had been holding her back. She had to stop comparing herself to the man John was becoming and start focusing on who she wanted to become as well. She couldn't rely on John's transformation to carry their relationship forward. She had to make her own changes too. But she didn't have to do it alone. John had proven that change was possible. If he could do it, so could she. One evening, as John returned home after a workout, Lisa sat down with him. The conversation was simple, yet profound. She told him about her feelings, how proud she was of him, but also how uncertain she had been about their future. She admitted that she had been struggling to keep up with the changes he had made, and she wasn't sure how to find her place in this new version of their relationship. To her surprise, John didn't respond defensively. He didn't brush off her concerns or minimize her feelings. Instead, he listened. He heard her. He understood. And in that moment, Lisa realized that the man she had married was still there. Only now he was more present, more aware of their relationship, and more committed to their future together than he had ever been. John didn't just want to transform his own life. He wanted to help her transform hers too. Together, they made a plan, one that wasn't just about him or about her, but about both of them. They agreed to set new goals together, to create routines that would strengthen their bond and keep them accountable to each other. They would both take time to invest in their own growth, but they would do it together as partners. It wasn't going to be easy. They both knew that change took time, and that there would be bumps along the way. But what they had learned through this process was that growth wasn't just about becoming the best version of yourself. It was about growing together, side by side, with patience, understanding, and support. By the end of the 90 days, John had accomplished what he set out to do. He had quit his unhealthy habits, transformed his body, and reinvented his mindset. He had gained more than just physical strength. He had gained emotional resilience, clarity, and confidence. But what he hadn't expected was how much the journey had changed his relationship with Lisa. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the two of them, growing and evolving together. Lisa, too, had begun her own transformation. It wasn't as outwardly visible as John's. There was no dramatic weight loss or physical change, but the shifts within her were just as powerful. She was no longer the passive observer in her own life. She was actively choosing to grow, to evolve, and to embrace the changes that had once seemed so daunting. As they looked ahead, both John and Lisa knew that their journey was far from over. They had made it through the 90 days, but their growth would continue. The real work, they realized, wasn't in the transformation itself, but in sustaining it. It wasn't about making quick fixes or taking shortcuts. It was about building a life that was meaningful, intentional, and full of love. And so, as they walked through this new chapter of their lives together, they knew one thing for sure. Change wasn't just something you could do on your own. It was something you had to do together. And with that realization, they were ready to take on whatever came next. As John entered the final weeks of his 90-day transformation, he realized that while the external changes were impressive, he had lost weight, his energy had surged, and his outlook on life was brighter. The hardest part wasn't the physical transformation. It wasn't even the mental adjustments he had to make. No, the hardest part was the pressure to keep it going. For the first time in a long time, John was afraid, not of failure, but of falling back into old habits. The temptation to slip into his old routines was constant. Old cravings, moments of stress, and even just the comfort of an easier life were all whispers pulling at him. It would have been easy to say, "You've done enough, you've changed, you've proven it. Now you can relax." But he knew better. The real test was not in completing the 90 days, but in sustaining the changes he had made and building on them. How many times had he reached a goal in the past, only to let the momentum fade? This time, he knew, it had to be different. But the pressure wasn't just on John. Lisa, too, was feeling it. She had supported him through every step of his journey, but now she was facing a new challenge. John had changed in ways that both amazed and intimidated her. His transformation wasn't just physical, he was different emotionally and mentally, too. He was more driven, more confident, and more focused on his goals. And while she was proud of him, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her own insecurities creeping up. She had been so focused on supporting John, on encouraging him, that she hadn't given herself the space to reflect on her own needs. She had been so caught up in his transformation that she hadn't even considered what it might mean for her own personal growth. For months, John had been making strides, improving himself, and growing. Lisa had been his rock, his steadying force. But now, she realized that she needed to take a step back and focus on herself. The changes John had made, while inspiring, had inadvertently made her feel stuck in her own life. She was proud of him, but she wasn't sure how she fit into this new equation. What about her goals? What about her growth? The realization hit her hard. She needed to change too. It wasn't just about being supportive of John's transformation, it was about her own journey. She had been living in the shadows of his progress, cheering him on, but never once asking herself what she wanted to change. For the first time, she felt a sense of urgency to address her own stagnation. Could she keep up with the new John? Was she ready to step into her own transformation? Lisa knew she couldn't wait for another year to pass without making changes in her own life. She needed to break free of the habits that had kept her in a place of complacency. Just like John had decided to quit his old ways and start fresh, she realized it was time for her to do the same. But this wasn't just about changing her habits, it was about changing the way she saw herself. She had been so focused on supporting others, on making sure John was okay, that she had forgotten to prioritize her own growth. But Lisa wasn't alone in this realization. John, too, had been wrestling with the fear of falling back into his old ways. It had been 90 days, and he had accomplished so much, but he knew it wasn't enough to simply reach the finish line. The challenge now was to make these changes stick. How could he maintain the discipline, the habits, and the mindset that had brought him so far? It wasn't just about willpower, it was about setting up a system of support, both for himself and for Lisa. One of the biggest hurdles John faced was the fear that once the 90 days were over, he might slack off. He had seen it before: people who start strong, get results, and then let things slide. What had kept him on track was the daily commitment, the small steps, the consistency. But as the finish line approached, he realized that consistency would be even more crucial after the 90 days were over. The danger of falling into complacency was greater now than it had ever been. John wasn't just focused on his own journey. He was also thinking about how they as a couple could maintain the positive changes they had both experienced. He realized that if they were going to continue to grow, they would have to do it together. Lisa's realization that she too needed to change was a turning point for both of them. They had spent so much time focusing on his transformation that they hadn't given enough attention to her own. But now, with both of them acknowledging the need for growth, they could set new goals, not just as individuals, but as partners. The hardest part for Lisa was admitting that she had been holding herself back. She had been afraid of taking that first step toward change, unsure of what it would mean for her own identity and for her relationship with John. But once she realized that change wasn't a threat, it was an opportunity, everything started to shift. She didn't have to follow John's path. She didn't have to be on the exact same journey, but she could make her own changes, work toward her own growth, and support John as he did the same. Together they began to set goals, not just for their health or physical well-being, but for their emotional and relational growth. They agreed that they would both work toward their own personal goals while supporting each other every step of the way. John would continue his fitness journey, while Lisa would take up a new hobby she had been interested in for years but had never made time for. They set aside time for date nights, for moments of connection that went beyond their busy lives. They realized that if they were going to make these changes stick, they would have to build their lives on a foundation of mutual support, trust, and shared growth. In the final weeks of the 90 days, John continued to make strides. He wasn't just looking for a quick fix anymore. He wasn't focused on the end of the challenge. He was focused on what came next. He knew that lasting change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, one that required continuous effort, self-reflection, and a commitment to growth. He had come so far, but he knew the real work was in maintaining these changes, in making them a permanent part of his life. And the same went for Lisa. Her personal transformation wasn't something that would happen overnight, but she was ready to take that first step, to invest in herself, and to embrace the changes that would take their relationship to the next level. The 90 days had been a powerful journey for both of them. But now, they were realizing that the real challenge wasn't about hitting a specific milestone. It was about sustaining the habits they had built, the mindset they had developed, and the emotional connection they had rekindled. As they stood together at the end of the 90 days, they realized that they were no longer the same people they had been when they started. They had both transformed, but this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one they would write together, with the lessons of the past 90 days shaping the path ahead. And as they looked ahead, they knew one thing for sure: change wasn't just something they had done for themselves, it was something they had done for each other. And that, above all, was the greatest transformation of all. As the final moments of John's 90-day transformation drew near, both he and Lisa found themselves standing at the edge of something truly remarkable, something that had begun as a personal challenge but evolved into a journey of rediscovery, not just for John but for both of them. The changes were evident, but the most important shift wasn't in how they looked on the outside, it was in how they saw each other, how they saw themselves, and how they realized that this transformation wasn't just about quitting bad habits, but about creating a new way of living. For John, these 90 days were more than just a physical overhaul. They had been a journey to reclaim his sense of self, to rebuild his confidence, and to take ownership of the life he had let slip away. He wasn't the same man he had been 3 months ago, the man who had felt trapped in his old patterns, disconnected from his own health, his own ambitions, and even his wife. The change in him was undeniable. His body was leaner, his energy was higher, his mind was clearer, and his relationship with Lisa had evolved into something deeper and more connected. But as John stood at the threshold of this transformation, he knew that this wasn't the end. It wasn't a destination. It was a beginning of a life lived with intention, a life of continual growth, and a life in which he was the one driving the direction. He had learned that change wasn't about reaching a goal and stop. It was about creating a new way of living, something sustainable, something that would last, and he had just scratched the surface. But the true victory wasn't just in John's personal success. It was in the way his transformation had impacted his marriage. Lisa had been his rock throughout the 90 days, supporting him through every challenge, every doubt, every temptation to fall back into old ways. She had witnessed his changes from the sidelines, always proud, but also uncertain. She had loved him throughout the process, but she had also felt herself starting to drift. It wasn't because she didn't care, it was because she didn't know how to fit into this new version of John. She hadn't realized that her own sense of self had been so tied to the old version of him, the man who relied on her to be the steady force in his life, the one who shared the same habits, routines, and even the same struggles. But now, as John had begun to grow, Lisa had been left behind in some ways. She didn't know if she could keep up with him, or if she was ready for this new dynamic. She had been so focused on supporting him that she hadn't taken the time to focus on herself, and that, she realized, was the key to moving forward. It took time, but Lisa eventually understood that John's transformation wasn't just about his body, his health, or his habits. It was about their relationship, their future, and the possibility of evolving together. She had spent years nurturing John, lifting him up, encouraging him through tough times, but she had neglected herself in the process. She had let her own dreams, her own growth, fall to the wayside. Watching John grow and change made her realize that she needed to do the same, and so, with a newfound sense of purpose, she began her own journey. She didn't have to mirror John's exact path. Her transformation wasn't about fitness or weight loss. It was about rediscovering her own passions, her own goals, and her own purpose. It was about realizing that she was worthy of her own time, her own attention, and her own growth. And just like John, she began to take steps to reclaim her own sense of self. What John and Lisa learned through this 90-day journey was something profound. It wasn't just about making changes for the sake of change. It was about understanding that transformation is a process, not a quick fix. It's a continuous journey of self-discovery, of overcoming challenges, and of adapting as life moves forward. The idea that a simple 90-day challenge could lead to such sweeping changes was eye-opening. But it wasn't the challenge that had done it. It was the commitment, the consistency, and the willingness to push through the tough moments, the temptations and the doubts. It was about choosing growth over complacency. It was about realizing that change doesn't happen overnight, but that every day is an opportunity to move toward a better version of yourself. For John, the fear of falling back into old habits was real. But what he learned was that lasting change doesn't come from forcing yourself to be perfect every day. It comes from building small habits, making intentional choices, and staying consistent, even when it's hard. The key to long-term success was to stop seeing transformation as a temporary goal and start seeing it as a permanent part of his life. The habits he had built weren't just something to follow for 90 days. They were the foundation for a lifetime of healthy living, both physically and mentally. He had learned that discipline wasn't about restriction. It was about freedom, the freedom to live life on his terms, to pursue the things that truly mattered, and to build a future that was aligned with his values. As for Lisa, she had learned something just as important, that personal growth wasn't something that had to happen in isolation. The journey she was on wasn't just hers, it was theirs. John's transformation had inspired her to look inward, to reevaluate her own life, and to embrace the changes she had long neglected. Together, they had come to understand that relationships grow when both people are growing, when both are committed to their own paths while supporting each other along the way. The key wasn't to change for each other, it was to change for themselves and to bring that growth into the relationship. When both partners are focused on their own growth and are supportive of each other's journeys, the relationship itself becomes something more meaningful, more dynamic, and more fulfilling. As the 90-day challenge came to an end, John and Lisa stood together, stronger than they had been in years. They had both undergone transformations, ones that had brought them closer together, but also allowed them to flourish as individuals. They had learned that change isn't something to fear, it's something to embrace. And while the 90 days might have been a milestone, the real journey was just beginning. They knew that life wasn't about checking off goals or reaching a certain point and then stopping. It was about moving forward together, continuing to evolve, and never settling for less than what they were capable of. Looking ahead, they both knew that challenges would come. They would face setbacks, doubts, and obstacles. But they also knew that they had the tools, the mindset, and the mutual support to navigate whatever came their way. The real lesson of these 90 days wasn't just about personal transformation. It was about the power of change, the strength that comes from within, and the unbreakable bond that forms when two people choose to grow together. So as they took their first steps into this new chapter of their lives, they knew one thing for sure: the future was theirs to create, and it was going to be better than they ever imagined.